So, anatomically, right, I will have to draw it, I guess. Well, I don't have to, but it probably makes sense. So that's kind of a general idea of the stomach. So there's a sphincter here, of course. Okay. What should we start with? We should start with the anatomical division. So that area here is cardia. You know, how do we call the gastritis, the reflux? What's the common name for it? Heartburn. Heartburn, right? The common name. I know you didn't, it wasn't a common name. So it has nothing to do with the heart, just like this cardia has nothing to do with the heart, with the name stuff. Fundus, body, pylorus. Okay? So, main digestive activities happen here, in the fundus and in the body. And it kind of makes sense. Look at this. Trying to digest food at the cardia is not best idea because esophagus is very close, and if you have some spillover of the digestive juices in the esophagus, that's heartburn. We can get in trouble. At the level of pylorus, two reasons. One, and I'm being very anthropomorphic, but digestive system allows for that. At this point, it's too late, dude. It's too late to digest. Food is about to enter duodenum. Second, you really don't want gastric juices to get into the duodenum. It's not the place, It's pretty acidic here. So most of the digestive functions happen in the fundus and the body. Cardia is pretty boring. It's like there's nothing happens. There's just part where the food enters into. Pylorus is very regulatory. Does that make sense? So presence of food in the pylorus plays an important regulatory function. It regulates the activities of the stomach. Also, of course, we should not forget another sphincter here. Pyloric, okay? Pyloric sphincter separates the stomach and the duodenum. Okay, we good so far? So, what should we start with? Okay, anatomically, curvatures, sure. The stomach is kind of folded inside. When you see folds in any structure, what does it tell you? Surface area. So basically, when it is empty, it's pretty small, it's not distended. They're pretty substantial rugae, the folds. When it is distended, rugae basically disappear. Few features, anatomical features of the stomach. 3 layers of smooth muscle. So you've got circular, longitudinal, and oblique, diagonal. If you think about, the position of the stomach in the alimentary canal, it makes perfect sense. Think of it. So, food in your mouth is pretty rough, okay? Whatever you're eating, it's, chunks. It goes through the esophagus, still chunks. Gets in the stomach, it has to be degraded, so to say, to the consistency of almost, water. Well, not water, but almost liquid, like smoothie. So 3 layers of the smooth muscle allows for very, very intense segmentation and mechanical digestion. Make sense? Epithelium, simple columnar. Now, what are the components of the gastric juice here? So main components are gastric lipase, pepsin, and hydrochloric acid. Well, we'll get to the mucus part. So gastric lipase, lipids or fats, right? Pepsin breaks down proteins. So far, if you think about, so it's the second, think of it this way. It's the second part of the alimentary canal that participates in the chemical digestion. Does that make sense? It's very convenient in a way to just think about digestive system. You can think of it as such. So you have three parts where chemical digestion occurs. It's mouth, it's stomach, and it's small intestine. In mouth, we just mentioned, you start breaking down carbs and lipids. In the stomach, you keep going with lipids and you start breaking down proteins. Spoiler alert, lipids are so tough that they're going to be, your digestive system is going to be breaking them throughout. Okay. Now cells. Which cells you can find in the stomach? Well, goblet cells. They produce mucus. Okay? Not just mucus, it's pretty basic mucus. Basic, I mean pH like above 7. Mucus mechanically protects the epithelium from the food, and it also chemically protects the epithelium from the acidity. Does that make sense? We'll get back to why you need hydrochloric acid there. You have parietal cells. They produce hydrochloric acid and, hydrochloric acid only. You have chief cells. These guys produce pepsinogen. We'll get to this part. And then you have ECL cells and G cells. ECL cells produce histamine. G cells produce gastrin. Okay. So when we were talking about endocrine system, we mentioned briefly the hormone ghrelin. I'm not going to pay too much attention to this. Hormone of, hunger. When your stomach is empty, it produces ghrelin. Ghrelin signals to the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus relays it to your cortex, and you know that you're hungry, basically. You need to. So what I'm going to focus on, few hormones, mostly gastrin and histamine, associated with the regulation of the stomach activities, and also on the mechanism of production of hydrochloric acid. Okay? So we're going to start with the regulation of stomach digestion. Let's put it this way. Okay? So I want to break it down into sort of two types of stimuli that stomach experiences. Remember what is the main stimulus for any digestive response, right? Food. You've got some food. And I mentioned earlier that there are two main types of stimuli in the digestive system: mechanical and chemical. So first you've got a mechanical stimulus. Which is distension. So stomach is distended. Does that make sense? And then I have chemical, which will involve actually two things. To a larger, okay, here's the question, really, really nice question. So we know that pH in the stomach is about 3, right? It's very acidic. So question is simple. You have to think before you answer. What happens to the pH of the stomach immediately after food enters it from the esophagus? Immediately. Up or down? Uh-huh. Can you explain why it's going up?
Because there's no stimulus for histamine.
Much simpler. The juices in the stomach are acidic, right? The food that you are eating is just not acidic. When you mix acid and not acid, the pH inevitably rises. You're basically diluting your acid. Does that make sense? So, increased pH and also presence of nutrients, of course. You know, like fats and carbs and amino acids. Okay? And that results in a couple of outcomes. One outcome is so-called vagovagal reflex. So if you look at the name vagovagal, so it goes stomach, right? Through the vagus nerve, stimulus to the medulla oblongata, you see, stomach, vagus nerve, sensory input to the medulla. Medulla generates the response, sensory output to the stomach. Does that make sense? Yeah. And you have signaling through the local plexus and gastric plexus, which is in the submucosal and in the muscularis. Okay. So, and these two result in the overall outcomes like this. You have increased mechanical digestion, that makes sense? And increased secretion. Does that make sense? We're good so far? Now, this is kind of, nervous system stimulation, because it's either local plexuses or through the CNS, but it's nervous. Now, what about hormonal regulation? So, kind of similar story. This time, the gastrin and the histamine are going to be involved. So food stimulates G cells, and they release gastrin. Okay? Food also, gastrin stimulates ECL cells, and they will release histamine. Make sense? These guys stimulate parietal and chief cells. Parietal cells will release hydrochloric acid. Chief cells will release pepsinogen. I'm going to pause for a second because I want to kind of wrap up. We're not going to go into mechanism of hydrochloric acid generation and other stuff. So far, does that make sense? Let's go over it one more time. So food stimulates G cells. It can be food. It can be even some nerve signals. Okay. The point is, G cells release gastrin. Gastrin stimulates ECL cells, which release histamine. Histamine stimulates parietal cells to release hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen. Not an enzyme yet. What happens next? Kind of cool. Pepsinogen is converted to pepsin. And hydrochloric acid is a catalyst here. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
And even more, even cooler, pepsin facilitates the process of converting pepsinogen into the pepsin. Does that make sense?
Why would you need to go? Wait, repeat what you said. Pepsin does.
So pepsinogen is converted to pepsin with the help of hydrochloric acid. Once pepsin is generated, it starts converting other pepsinogen into itself.
Oh, okay.
It serves as an auto catalyst, sort of, you know. Does that make sense? So we covered two hormones already, gastrin and histamine here. A couple more, very sort of minimal, so to say. So food will also stimulate the release of serotonin, which will result in the increased motility. Okay? Does that make sense? Now, so far, if you look at this, food only sort of stimulates, stimulates digestion through the vago-vagal reflex, local plexuses, gastrin-histamine system, increased motility by serotonin. All hell breaks loose basically at this point. You need something that would inhibit it a little bit, would put some brakes on it. And turns out food itself, when food is closer to the pylorus, closer to the duodenum, it will stimulate our old friend somatostatin, which is a different name for GHIH, growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Decreased motility, decreased secretion. Does that make sense?
So do you need that just because you don't want to digest too fast?
Basically, yes. That's a very good question that you asked. And I don't want to sort of put you on spot and ask, why don't you need to digest too fast? The ability of intestine to digest and, importantly, absorb the nutrients is limited. So if my memory serves me well, food spends about 2 hours in the stomach and about 6 to 8 in the intestine. So you want the food to get into the intestine in a very small portions. If you will remove this, so to say, brakes from the equation, it will just churn through and will just push everything through the pyloric sphincter into the duodenum, duodenum is very short, it will be massive malabsorption, I would say. It will just race through just because.
There's no space.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about duodenum next time, but the surface area, as far as I remember, is about 15 square feet for the duodenum. It's not that big because the volume of the food bolus that goes through the pyloric sphincter every time, like once in a while, it's about 3 milliliters. It's very small. It's spread super thin on the surface. Does that make sense? And last little sort of comment here. See this? One of the side effects on an overdose on antihistamines is constipation. Because they inhibit histamine receptors on the parietal cells and chief cells, and it can't digest. Make sense? Awesome.